All right. So today we're going to be talking about object orientation, and how we can use it in JavaScript to make our code reasonable, right? I think there's a lot of like, especially by the end of the phase, because it feels like this is a thing thrown in near the end. That's a requirement for the project. There's a lot of like, but why? Because certainly in terms of like JavaScript, right? You don't have to code in object orientation when you're writing JavaScript solutions to things. It's not always the thing that developers do. It's a recent thing that actually that we've had like innate class-based syntax in JavaScript. Before that, there was some crazy stuff that I'll probably get into tomorrow. Ways that JavaScript developers hack their way around into getting object-oriented syntax. But first off, as a heads up, tomorrow's lecture or tomorrow's like mini lecture is going to be recorded. It is, but we are having one. And the premise is I'm teaching this completely ass backwards. I am teaching, I'm going to be teaching a bunch of, using a bunch of tools today that I will then be teaching what they are tomorrow. And the reason for that is because I find that teaching things like this and functional context in a vacuum is really hard. You'd go like, why am I learning this? This looks like a weird trick of JavaScript. That being said, it's super important to object orientation, super important to meta programming in JavaScript, and writing neat JavaScript code. And I'm going to show you a couple examples today why it's important to understand like what we're going to be learning today. I think I lost the what I'm trying to say is today will hopefully open your eyes to why you need to attend tomorrow or you should learn stuff tomorrow. We'll see though. But basically what we're doing with JavaScript, I think by now you have done at least 3 weird challenging assignments. You've done the DOM challenge, you've done Toy Tales, you've done Dog CEO, a couple of others, but those are the 3 big ones where I'm sure at some point you got to the point where you were like, my code is a mess. I don't understand it. I have trouble like coding my way around in it. I don't know where to go to look for things. And that's a really frustrating place to be in JavaScript. It's somewhat solved by React. Before that, it was somewhat solved by jQuery. A bunch of other frameworks have come up to try to solve the problem of your code's messy. But one of the most basic tools that we have at our disposal as developers in most languages for making our code way more organized is object orientation. As Ruby developers and as people who started your coding journey in Ruby, you have a huge advantage here over people who start with a language like JavaScript, learning it in a functional way. I think you have all seen that point in Rails where you're like, okay, I know where this is in Rails just by virtue of how Rails is structured. And I'm sure that at some point you dream of that, like having that in JavaScript. And that's what we're going to be trying to build out today. That's kind of what object orientation will do for us. It does a bunch of other things too. It cleans up our code. It makes it easier to read. It gives us access to things. Like usually when today we're going to be coding with the closure method and like, or the closure design pattern rather than event delegation. And I think you'll remember the last several times I've been coding out huge functions that had all of our information in it. We're going to have a way around that with object orientation that still keeps track of even more data than we had before and allows us to re-access it, which I'll get to on Thursday. So there's a ton of useful tools that come out of object orientation, and writing object-oriented code makes other developers like you, makes it so that you can follow your own code, and just like a really useful tool. So that's kind of why I'm going to be diving really hard into object orientation for the next 3 weeks. As a side note, when I was a student, I went through the in-person program, which is for a bunch of rubes who don't learn as much stuff as you do. They skip a bunch of sections. One of them was mandatory object orientation on their JavaScript project. They taught us object orientation. And then I went on to make a game I was pair programming with a partner. And the first half I did not in object-oriented code. I just coded my way through the next problem, right? Without any real sense of like pattern. I was like, I'll solve this later. And the second half of my code I did with object orientation. And the first half of that, my code, to this day, I think the last time I tried was like 2 years ago. So or a year and a half ago. So to this, a year and a half ago, I have not been able to refactor the first half of my code. It is too messed up inside of a functional scope. Meanwhile, that week, at one point, I had to completely redo some of my code for the part that I had done in object orientation. What I had was I had a side-scrolling shooter, and I wanted my spaceship to have two lasers that shot out the wings rather than the nose, one out the nose. And that refactor took me 5 minutes with object orientation. So I've been there as a student being like, okay, why do I need to learn this? I'm just going to code my solution. And then I've learned the hard way why object orientation will solve problems for you. But what it is, like, kind of, first off, I should give you an introduction to what we'll be doing today. So we have this app that was built by my former coach, who went on to become a lead instructor that I was a coach for, who went on to become head of curriculum, Ian Hollander, great person. You've probably seen his name on every lab. This is an app that he built in vanilla JavaScript that I'm going to be seizing and refactoring into object orientation. So right now, like, if we take a look at his code, it's interesting. So we've got his event listeners. We've got a little dark mode feature that I'm not going to be messing with today, but it's very cool. We've got these like selectors. We're currently using event delegation, right? We're seeing like this animal list has event.target.dataset.action, free to the wild, then find the card using closest, and then use the ID and then like delete it. We have the ability to donate to an animal, just like we did with cats. You know, we can donate to Timmy, Kimmy, Wimmy, Shimmy. We have a bunch of animal facts here. We can delete, and there's also this handle form submit right here that will post things, and at the bottom is the actual thing that loads it. We're fetching, then we're passing the animal data into this render all animals, then we're iterating through all of these, calling render one animal, and then we're creating stuff within our HTML. Cool. So that's what we're going to be changing today. And we're going to be changing into object orientation. We're also going to be using closures rather than event delegation. But that's what we're going to be doing. And we're going to be doing this all in object orientation, a syntax which some of you might not have seen before. So I'm going to start out by just giving you an example of what object-oriented code looks like. And I'm going to start by creating this little folder called SRC. Now in JavaScript, one convention is whenever you're creating a class, try to create it in its own file and then give that file a capital letter. So make it camel case with the first letter capitalized too. I'm definitely going to get better at speaking today. So I'm going to be like test class.js. Cool. Class. Oh wait, I'm going to now go ahead and I'm going to say right in my index.html, hey, let's also grab from here source test class.js. Cool. I can test that this loaded by saying console.log hello from test class. Yeah.
Why did you put a defer on that one?
Oh, that's a good question. I'm going to talk about that in a second. I've also learned that my headphones are much louder than I anticipated. We've got the console log, and then I'm going to talk about this. So defer, right? For index.js. Index.js, we're expecting to use things from the DOM immediately on initialization. Like when it loads, the first thing it's going to do is make some query selectors for us, right? When we're defining stuff inside of a class, what we're really defining is going to be a series of methods that will be invoked elsewhere, right? And in this case, I don't like, since my index.js will be invoking all of the methods from my class, if this is deferred, right? Then it's not going to run anything from this until afterwards. So this is just me being like, hey, like by doing this, I forbid myself from like writing query selectors outside of a class inside of my JS file. I'm trying to make this class help us do other things, but I'm trying to not make it the thing that immediately runs. This will make a lot more sense later.
The object code for the actual class is in
Yeah.
there, whereas the index.js is actually what's running it.
Yeah. So this will become a lot clearer once we're like looking at these classes, right? So let's ask me that again near the end of lecture. Cool. So I'm going to do class test class, right? Cool. I'm going to start with this. This right here defines a class. This might look similar to those of you who were with us for the previous phases. Does it look like anything to us? Looks a lot like class test class in Ruby or test class in Ruby, which this is not actually how you write a class in Ruby, but I'm just going to do that to like show you. This looks familiar, right? If we go over to our backend, right, we'll actually see several examples of class. This right here is going to be replaced by something called extends in JavaScript, right? But class, some name for a class, and then end is still the same right here, with the exception that we're doing brackets. What's up, Naomi?
Okay, so I just started on extend and I don't really understand it. Like, is that equivalent when you're creating a class and you're inheriting from the active record application type thing?
Yes, you
Or-
can inherit from other classes, right? And that might be something that I'll show you tomorrow. But we're going to dig into extends later. It's not going to be something that you'll necessarily need to do for this project. I've never really seen someone extend a DOM class in their student project. But that might be because how I teach it, of how I teach it. But basically, you can always make a class inherit from another class and then grab some of their methods. And we'll talk about that a bit tomorrow, and then probably a bunch next week. Cool. So here, right, we now have this class syntax, right? And in Ruby, if I want it to be like class test class end, right? Let's say I wanted to make initializing an instance of a test class take in an argument, right? How would I do that in Ruby? And then set equal to, let's say I wanted to take in an argument of a number and set equal to a number. Cool. We could do something like this, right? Def initialize cheese. Whoops. At cheese equals cheese, right? Cool. In JavaScript, we do something a little bit similar. We do constructor cheese. Oops. Oh God, this is gonna mess with me. Cool. This dot cheese equals cheese. Yeah. Constructor is JavaScript's version of initialize, and that I can say with confidence. This is not JavaScript's version of self, and that's going to be the subject of tomorrow's conversation. It's going to feel a lot like self today, and then if you believe that in your head, you'll be wrong forever, and it'll lead to a couple of bugs. Cool. That being said, there are a lot of ways where we can use it in a similar way in terms of our design pattern if we follow some road rules. Cool. But I'm going to go ahead really quickly and show you what this gives us, right? I'm going to refresh this page. So I call new test class. I'm actually going to set this equal to a constant. Instance equals new test class Gouda, right? So this is dangerous. Like thinking about this as like an instance variable is dangerous. What this is really the functional scope that we're working in, which we're going to talk about a bit tomorrow. If we stay within some defined boundaries in our JavaScript class, we will have ways to make it act a lot like self by just making sure that this is always going to be the JavaScript equivalent of self. So basically, this can be a bunch of different things. If I call this on the main scope, it'll say window. You're executing this function on window, right? Like the functional scope right now is the window. So self, right, is going to do something kind of similar in Ruby. I'm going to talk a lot more about the differences tomorrow. I'm going to show you one error from assuming that's like self today. For now, we're not going to worry about the details of what this is. We're just going to be using it. Cool. But so we have this instance of the test class, right? And there are no real private methods in JavaScript. You can pretend there are, but there aren't. So I can always call instance.cheese. I can get Gouda, right? So right now I've initialized an instance of the test class, and we've passed in Gouda as the argument. And you'll notice that we now have access to the this.cheese that we can use. So if I would create a second instance, let instance2 equal new test class cheddar, right? Instance2.cheese is going to give me cheddar. Instance.cheese will still give me Gouda. Have I lost anyone yet? What's the most confusing part of this?
I have a question. I'm just wondering, are this.cheese, is that a type of attribute?
Yeah, so what we're really saying right here, if we console log this here, we can see that it says, hey, this is an instance of the test class. And so remember that everything in JavaScript can have attributes on it, right? Like I can go ahead and I can be like function, say hi, log hi, right? Say hi. I get hi, right? I can also go ahead and say, say hi, the function has cheese, right? And it's equal to Gouda. And now say hi still works. Say hi dot cheese is now equal to Gouda. You can apply, like, as long as it's not a primitive, a JavaScript primitive, you can apply attributes to anything you want, right? And I think actually, if we go ahead, let's go ahead and console log this instead. Say hi. Oh, no, it stays the window, right? Because the functional context. Foolish. Yep, we'll talk about that a bunch tomorrow. So that's something that would be different. Self right here would probably give us something different. I'm not sure. It's been a while. But this attribute, right, is just being assigned as a key value pair onto what this is, which is in this case the instance. When we're inside of our constructor, this is the instance that we're dealing with, right? So we can, on the instance, we can apply as many key value pairs as we want.
Got it.
So that's tough because, well, Brian, I'm actually going to say wait till tomorrow to answer that, because we're going to be talking a lot about how we can change this, right? And rather than really worrying about what this is today, I want to like really focus on how we can use it. But yeah. Naomi, what's up?
So it's an instance of a new object, right?
It's
Or
an instance of a new test class.
oh,
right?
so instance of a class. Okay, cool.
Yeah. So much like in Ruby, right? If we called like test class.new Gouda, right? We would have to like write a little reader method right here to get that cheese, but we could get it. Here in JavaScript, we don't need to write any reader methods because none of these are private. They're all just key value pairs that we're assigning to the object. But otherwise, basically the same. We can then do stuff with that, right? We can write a little function, right? In this case, when you're writing in a class, you do not use the word function right here. Or sorry, yes, you do. You don't do like function, say cheese, right? You do just say cheese, bloop, bloop, console.log this.cheese plus is my favorite kind of cheese. Yeah. So it's very similar to writing right here. Def say cheese. At cheese puts is my favorite kind of cheese. I'm going to fix this a little bit. Boop. Great. Cool. Still looks messy. So Naomi, that's a really good question. We don't need one, an attribute accessor, right? Because like these are just key value pairs, so we don't need to tell it to let these be public. Every single one of these, this.cheese will be a public method. If you want to be a good JavaScript developer and you want to be a signal to other people, please don't use this. It's very common to do this, right? There's also a way of writing, there's also syntax called get cheese right here that would make this work, right? Which would return this.cheese like this. I'm going to get into this in a bit, right? But yes, you can write getter and setter methods right here, which will allow you to not have to put a little parentheses right here. I can show you. I'm double checking that my code's right. Cool. So now I've changed this. So now this dot underscore cheese is different, right? This is just a different variable. I've called it underscore cheese. The underscore, right, makes it a different variable. It also says to other developers, it's like a little syntax to say like, hey, don't use this outside of the class. This is meant to be an internal thing. Then we have this getter method, right? Which will allow us to go ahead and say, let's go say, let instance2 equals this, cool, instance2.cheese. And it's going to return cheddar, right? Despite the fact that really underscore cheese is what's stored underneath the hood, right? But if I want to be like fancy, I can write a getter method that behaves slightly differently. So now instance2.cheese is the real cheese right here. But if I ask the class using my getter method, hey, what's your cheese? It says fancy cheddar, right? We can also do this with setter methods in a very similar way. We go ahead and say set cheese arg. This dot underscore cheese equals arg. So if you want to, this is getting a little more niche than you necessarily need to go for the project, right? But if you want to make sure that these actual arguments stay safe and that you have like your own setter and getter to like do things, much like we did in JavaScript, you can go ahead and do that. So right here, if I go try this again, instance2.cheese now equals Swiss. 2 now has an underscore cheese equal to Swiss, right? And if I call dot cheese on it, it's gonna give me fancy Swiss because that was what my getter said. Yeah. And then if I call say cheese on instance, which one will I get? Will I get Swiss is my favorite kind of cheese or fancy Swiss is my favorite kind of cheese? Yeah, if I call say cheese. I get fancy Swiss. And the reason for that, right, is that this dot cheese is now using the reader method. We don't actually have a variable called this dot cheese directly. We're using this reader method to define it. You could also go ahead and write a reader method like this. And often I will because I'm lazy. Return fancier this dot cheese, right? The issue here, if you write a reader method like this, you have to use parentheses. That's it. Cool. So a getter method, really what it is a fancy way of writing a function, right? That you don't have to use parentheses in front of. That's all it really is. That being said, it is used primarily to access data that exists here. Naomi, what's up?
Okay, so to call say cheese with the console log this cheese plus this is my favorite kind of cheese, you would just call out say cheese parentheses and then it will display in a
You'd have to
console.
call it on the class, right? If I just write say cheese. Oh, weird. What did I do? Right, yeah. Why are we console logging the whole? I'm not sure this is wrong. Yeah, it seems like it's actually returning the whole function, which is unusual. Oh, right. These are named differently. Sorry. I'm now returning this. I should comment this out before I do that. Sorry. I'm gonna go ahead. Oop. Cool. This is getting a little bit weird. The last thing I want to show really quickly, and then we'll do one last quick talk about what we did here. There's also static methods, which we'll go ahead. Yes, method. Say hi to friend. Console.log saluton friend. Cool. Now a static method is called on the class. Test class dot say hi to friend. I'm going to say Jimmy. Saluton, Jimmy. Cool. What does this seem like it's like? How would I write this in Ruby? I'm just going to go ahead and create a test class.rb.
Is it like a a class method.
That's exactly right. It's like a class method. How would we do that in Ruby?
Self dot whatever the name of the method is. Yeah. Oh, hello, friend.
Oh no, Mickey forgets how to string interpolate in Ruby. There we go. There we go. Cool. So now if we wanted to like get really specific with what we're doing here, let's do def cheese. Fancy. At cheese. Def cheese equals arg. At cheese equals arg. And then that gets us the rest of the way there. So this is this, we've built this, this is how we would write this in Ruby, right? We've initialized taking an argument of cheese and then pass it into an instance method, right? In JavaScript, we do it like this. This dot underscore cheese equals this, right? Get cheese is going to be our reader method right here and returns fancy cheese. Set cheese is going to be a writer method. It does this. Say cheese is going to be a method that prints self.cheese. And then this right here is going to be a class method that we can call in the whole class. Yeah. So class methods, you use the term static. Getter and setters are mostly just little tools you can use. You don't need them, right? You can always write a getter method to always use a parentheses as just a regular method, right? A setter method, you can just set your arguments directly, and that will be fine for your project. These are two tools that are very helpful though. And say cheese right here is a function, right? We can also write our functions like this. We can be like, hey, say cheese harder equals, and we can go ahead and write this little arrow function if we want. Cool. This is gonna work too. And the last
Doesn't
thing
the
I'm gonna,
constructor,
yeah, go ahead. Go for it.
doesn't the constructor already create the cheese method? So I'm trying to figure out if we're using the constructor, why we need a getter and setter method then, or we don't.
So right here, this right here, this dot cheese, if I did it like this, then I wouldn't want either of these. I would just be using this dot cheese directly. Cool. If I wanted to give myself some rules for how to access them, I'd be able to. These, which is why I'm saying the getter and setter are a little bit less useful. If I actually did run this like this, I'm gonna get an error. I think. Oh, did I not? Interesting. Oh, right, because right, if I did this, then I would get an error. Because in this case, this would decide to call my setter method, which would then call my setter method in here, right? So just be aware if you're using getter and setter, use underscores. Because right here, this setter method is calling itself here. And it's being called here. But if I go right here, I say this right here, I use underscores the whole time. This will work. I'm not going to be using getter and setter usually during the course of this. So if we want to make this the simplest possible version, this right here has static methods. It has a couple of methods, and this will work for us. We can go ahead and we can call let instance two dot cheese. Instance two dot say cheese. Instance two such cheese harder. This. We all good here? What's the weirdest part of this so far? This is mostly for if you want to control how people get or set variables in your instance. But if you don't need to, you can go ahead and do this. Great.
9 times out of 10, we don't have to worry about that, or
Yeah.
I'm confused by like, what's the scenario that we would have to do that?
You never have to do this. This is always easier tools that you can use to make your code a little bit better. I rarely use get and set is the honest truth. Because I have no problem just putting parentheses after things. There'll be times, right, where you want to be like, hey, I don't really want this to be a function. But like, let's say right here, I could, instead of getting a variable, I could be like, hey, get element from DOM, loop, loop. I can be like document dot query selector, like this is an imaginary scenario, right? This dot cheese dot this, right? And then all I need to do, right, to get this is I could be like, now let's imagine we have something on the DOM called cheddar. Cool. Now if I call instance two dot what I say element from DOM, it's going to go ahead and just print that out for me without me ever having to use parentheses, which is going to be great if you want to start chaining something and don't want to feel like you're calling a function the whole time. But it's just some syntax sugar. I didn't really mean to get fully into it, but then I got carried away. Cool. This is all you really need to get by in JavaScript. These bad boys. The last thing I'll show you, you can always create other things here. I can be like static all, and then I could be like this dot constructor dot all dot push this, which would be the same thing as doing add all. This dot class dot all dot push, or sorry, self dot class dot all dot push self, right? Or add it all. So you can define things that aren't functions like this, right? And then we can go ahead and we'd have like a reader method here, def self dot all. And this is something you can do right here.
I got a question about your usage of this with constructor. That's
a very good question. Let me just explain that.
Okay, line 7.
That is the same thing as like saying like, hey, go from this instance to its whole class. This is like calling class in in Ruby, and saying, give me its class. The constructor is also a term to mean this class. Cool.
Nikki?
Yeah.
Hi. I went ahead to the extend function for the classes.
We're going to talk about that a bit later.
Oh, okay.
But we're going to probably talk about it tomorrow.
All
right. So at this point, is there anything confusing about this particular code? Because I do want to hop on to what we're planning on building today, but I want to make sure that like at least the constructor, the idea of creating an instance method and creating a static method, do all three of those things make sense? Cool. All right. well, I'm going to be building a ton of these. So here I'm going to go in and I'm going to create a new file that I'm going to, well, let's actually wait. So there's a bunch of things that I want to refactor here. Constructor is used mostly this way, right? Where we pass in an argument and then that calls our constructor. It's the same thing as initialize in Ruby. So as another example of how we can use the constructor, right? Right now I'm noticing we have all these fetch calls, right? This fetch, this fetch, this fetch, and then this fetch right here. And here, there's like some easy refactoring I can do, right? In this case, right, last time we did something called the adapter pattern. We used a plain old JavaScript object to do that. Another very common thing to do is to go ahead and create something like an API service class. And here, I'm going to go ahead and first import this, and then we can talk about a little bit what it does. So I'm going to call it class API service. Cool. And here I'm going to take in the constructor. I'm going to take the root URL, right? Or the API itself, right? I just call this.api equals API. Cool. Now here in my JavaScript code, I'm going to pull these two things to the side. I might move this Explorer to the other side if I can, just in case my recording has started overwriting that again. Cool. So now here, right, I can go ahead and call this really quickly with new API service. And we can go ahead and say HTTP :// localhost 3000. Yeah. So nothing really fancy yet. We can call API. Oops. Right, I'm going to call this const API equals this bad boy. API right here. It's going to give me an instance of the API service class. Cool. And we can call it API.api and find out which where we're sending this to, right? By the adapter pattern, we can now go ahead and do something like get all animals, return. Boop. API get all animals. But then, loop. We'll just go ahead and make this less redundant. Then render all animals. Very neat code. We can refresh our page, see that it works. Oh, no. Saves, that's the issue. Now this works. So what I did here is I initialized an instance of the API class. Yeah, I'm going to walk through all of this, right? I initialized an instance of the API class, right? Service class. Called it API. We're not going to need to use extend at all during this entire project build. So I'm going to talk about that way later. Right now, I'm just initializing this API class, right? And I am then on line 138, I am calling its method get all animals, right? And I'm going to rewrite this slightly. I would say like, hey, let's go ahead and use this.api. Yeah. So what this is saying is fetch to this address, then parse the response as JSON, and then on its response, render all the animals. This is really short for response to render all the animals response. Do you kind of see how this works? Is there a part of this that makes less sense than the rest? What I'm doing here is I'm passing in a function called render all animals that takes in, that by default takes in an animal's argument and then iterates through it, right? So we're just giving it a function to call and passing the response to. Cool.
Wait, I have a question.
Mhm.
So, okay, so why wouldn't you use, oh, wait, so the dot API dot get all animals is pretty much like a, oh, wait, I get it. Never mind. Never mind.
Nice. Yeah, this is a function that I'm calling from over here. I've this instance of an API class. This is what's called a singleton class design pattern, where you create an instance of a class, right? Expecting to only use one instance to do your code. It's really good for code organization. And that's it. But it's very helpful. We're going to get to a more complicated class in about 8 minutes, hopefully. I named my API variable right at the top here. So I'm going to go ahead and do this with the rest of our fetch calls. You'll also notice, right, if I didn't want to use these parentheses, I could go ahead and say like get this and then write it like this. And then, oops, that gets mad at me because I didn't save. There we go. Cool. And this would also work, right? So this getter method could also be used to do a fetch. In this case, I think that's a little, I think the reason I'm not going to do this is because like I've seen this done before where you use getter methods all the time, right? But in future API calls, there's going to be ones where I need to take in an argument, so I might as well just make them all functions. As for how does this page know to render info from your API service file, I went ahead and in index.html, I did this. Cool. So I'm going to factor out the rest of these. I'm going to be like, hey, free animal ID return. Make this taken an ID. And we don't need a console log because we've already done that. All right, loop. Gonna make this a little bit neater. Boop. Boop, boop. Great. And so I'm going to now call API a free animal ID. And this I tried to remove. I'm going to get rid of some of these notes. Get all animals. That's a very good question. Sorry, just getting rid of some of this weird stuff. The second then is right here. So I'm returning the result of the first two fetch. The fetch, then the response. It's doing this. It's basically doing these two things, and then I'm just chaining a dot then onto it. This is how we use this. This is like the weird kind of way we do this in the API service class, but it works. So I'm going to try it right here. Again, I'm going to delete some of this. Bloop, bloop.
Wait, why would you want the second then in your index file class?
That's a really good question. The reason I do this is because at this point, so basically when you create when you start doing object orientation, a lot of people who do object orientation have this really big philosophy that your object should encapsulate its domain only. In this case, its job is to send a request to the server, right? Its job is not to put things on the DOM, right? That's going to be the job of some other code, right? Eventually, I'm probably going to like move a lot of this to a different class that's in charge of dealing with animals. So some people, I've seen a lot of students do this, where they do all three parts of their fetch right here, including handling the response. I think that's bad separation of concerns. I think in creating an instance of an API service class, its job should really just be to do the request for you, not to handle what to do with the response. And that's a very opinionated piece of coding from me, but I think it kind of falls into a little bit of object-oriented best practice, where like if you went to this code and you were like, and you saw that I was somehow rendering all of the animals from API service, it would take you a while to find that. You'll be like, where are these animals coming from? And you go, oh, there's an API service class. That's probably not it. It's probably in charge of talking to the API. But if it's also in charge of rendering out all the animals, that suddenly confuses other coders and it kind of breaks the domain pattern. It doesn't quite belong there. And that's kind of my opinion there. But I think it's backed up with best practice. Does that make any sense?
Yeah,
Cool.
definitely.
I'm going to do a couple more of these, right? We're going to be like, donate. This one takes in an ID and a number of donations. I'm going to return. In this case, they're doing something kind of cool here that I do want to talk a little bit about. In this case, Ian, I guess, decided to use optimistic rendering here. So he's going ahead and before you even before the fetch even returns, he's updating it, right? We talked a bit about this earlier. He's saying, hey, regardless of whether we error out on the DOM, update by 10. And Omar, you're absolutely right. I'm going to talk about that in 1 second. So right here, we're doing this donation, and we don't necessarily need to change .then on it if we don't want to. We can just go ahead and just immediately change the donations, and that's what this code's doing here. As I'm currently refactoring, a really good principle when you're refactoring is don't try to also update how your code works or behaves. When you're refactoring, your job is just to like get it back to baseline, and then afterwards go back to like being like, okay, I kind of want this code to change a little bit differently. So that's like the practice that Sandy Metz lays out. Like, but you also get to, there's red light, green light refactor. It's like first make it work, right? Go from like this test isn't passing to this test is passing, then refactor your code, then check that again. And that's like a really common way for developers to work. So right now I'm going to keep this as optimistic rendering. I might change my opinion later. Omar, in terms of making these all static methods, that is also another way to do this, right? I could go ahead right here and I can make these all static and it would behave much the same way. The only difference right here, and this is like, it's totally fine to make your API service class just a class that has only class methods. The one thing I'd caution is then we couldn't do this study. We couldn't initialize it with an API. So you'd have to like create the API up here. Which isn't the end of the world. I've totally made class method only API service classes. So like if I went ahead right here and I was like static, get all animals, the only thing I'd have to change is this .api and that would still work. Yeah.
What would you change it to? You would change it to,
I'd have to either hard code it or I'd have to like do something up here like const API equals this, and then you'd have to like set it up. And
Just-
definitely, yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, static functions don't take this dot blah, blah, blah syntax.
They do, but this is going to refer to the class, right? So in this case, we wouldn't have access to the constructor. Yeah, you don't have a constructor for a class because you like this right here is the constructor for the class, what we built right here. I could always be like static API equals this bad boy. And I think that would probably be the way I would go about doing it, right? If I wanted to make this a service class, I would go right here. Boop. And then you can ditch all this and you can write static, static. And then if we went back over here, we can instead say boop. Oops. API service that get all animals. And this should still work. So in this case, we're just making these all class methods that are called on the class itself. That's totally fine. It's a singleton class, not using an instance. And both of these are equally appropriate, depending on which one you're more comfortable with when you're dealing with singleton classes. We're gonna go back to the old way for now, though. And I earnestly don't have a preference. I've coded with both. Cool. So I think we've got one more, right? Create animal, new animal. Boop.
When you create a new, for example, in this case, animal, is it going to store in your API or just in the database?
In our API, because that's why we're making all these fetch requests, right?
Okay.
Cool. So here we now have this new animal. It's going to return the second then, and then it'll go ahead and do some stuff. I'm going to clean up more notes. Be like render one animal. Cool. So this right here is going to get all of our fetches out of our code. We can test that these all work. I'm going to add Sue, the T-Rex, had this planned because respect for Chicago's Field Museum. Cool. T-Rex. I'm learning from my mistake. Last time I taught this, I hyphenated T-Rex. And this T-Rex particularly eats anything in its path. And we're going to go ahead and say we didn't stop to think whether or not we should, because we resurrected to the T-Rex. Up, we got one error. First off, I'm going to go ahead and change this to API real quick. That wasn't the error we're getting. So it's saying currently cannot read property then of undefined. I didn't put a return right here. Boom. Yeah. This function needs a return statement, otherwise it's just going to return undefined. And then when I called API.createAnimal.then, it was returning undefined there. Cool. Sue, the T-Rex. T-Rex. Cool. And now we get Sue the T-Rex over here. Cool. We can donate money to Sue. Uh-oh. Patch to localhost 3000/8 not found. That's another thing we should fix. /animals/this. Boom. And then this is going to be the same thing. Cool. I double check that. So you notice how, despite the fact that I hit donate a bunch of times and it was increasing here because I'm optimistically rendering, it didn't show up. I'm going to go ahead and delete the suited the T-Rex. This all works again. Anyone struggle with how I did this? I built the singleton class. It's very similar to when we did plain old JavaScript object. We just made it into a fancy little class. How are we feeling? Cool.
I
We're
feel
about to get.
like, oh,
Yeah, go for it, Naomi.
I feel like I can actually understand it more because it's much more organized. Like I just hate disorganized code from the beginning, and I think it was hard to follow up of the last time. Yeah.
For sure. And if you like this in terms of organized code, we're about to get way more organized. Cool. I'm about to show you what I meant to teach you this lecture, right? So we did this API service pattern and we built a singleton class. Singleton classes are well and good. They're a fancy way to organize code. Don't listen to anybody who tells you that they're an anti-pattern. They're great. I think that was like an argument in the 90s or the 80s. But let's go ahead and let's now make a real class that does cooler things. Our next thing right now, if we look at our page, right? When I think about object orientation, I think about object orientation is great for when you have a set of very similar objects that have to both have behaviors and encapsulate their own data, right? And a really good example of this is each of these animals, right? It's not because they have like we're dealing with a database backend that has a bunch of instances of animals, right? Like it's not because we're building the animal table. Right now, what I'm seeing is 7 different components on the page that all behave in exactly the same way, except they hold different data, right? And when you see that, a very good thing to do is think, time for me to create a class to do this. So yeah, let's create an animal.js. Animal.js. Class, animal. Boop. Console log hello from the animal class. Cool. And now we can go ahead and change our index.html. Say, cool. We now have this hello from the animal class. And I'm going to go ahead. I'm going to start with constructor, take in an animal, the data from the backend. I'm just going to do like this dot animal equals animal. I know this will eventually end up with us calling animal.animal, but I want to store our actual data from the backend somewhere in this instance. Cool. I'm going to go right back here. And in my render one animal function, rendering all animals, render one animal goes right here. I'm going to go ahead and go called new animal obj. Const animal equals new animal obj. And then I'm going to just like run a little debugger right here. Cool. So now, first time we initialize an animal, we can be like, hey, first off, where are we at? We're in the window still. I'm calling from my debugger this animal. And now I have this instance of an animal that has animal stuff on it, right? I can find out about that animal and stuff like that, right? We can now use this. We can use this to create methods on the animal. We can start in the most simple way. I can be like, hey, ant, let's go ahead, generate HTML equals, or oops, boop, boop, boop. Going to go right here, going to and setting an object. Want to be a little bit more specific there? I'm trying to follow that question.
Like, it's when you're using class, I'm just trying to grasp the difference of like, if you had an object with all of the attributes of the JSON that you fetched, why use a class instead of an object?
You're saying like, yeah, I could totally do like right here. I could be like, hey, so what you're describing is a real design pattern that people used before we had access to classes. It's called the factory pattern. I'll probably show it to you tomorrow. You can do anything that you would do in a class with a plain old JavaScript object. You could create a factory that takes in an argument and initializes a new plain old JavaScript object for you. That would hold the data and a bunch of functions. It's messy and it's a little confusing. But all of this is just syntactic sugar for doing that underneath the hood. So I'm going to talk a little bit tomorrow. We're going to build out a factory function version of this tomorrow if I have time. But yes, that is totally a thing you can do. The thing is, this is just very neat and written in classic object-oriented code, and like it's something you can read. Whereas in your case, you would have to create a function that takes in an argument and then returns a new function that has like some sort of behaviors. Cool. So here I'm going to like pull this out right here. And I'm just going to go ahead and I'm going to return loop. I'm just going to take this code and put it into mine. And this isn't going to be the final version. I'm going to change it a bit. But right now, here I can now call, I'm just going to call, hey, animal.generate HTML. Whoop. And then what I'm doing here is instead of animal object, right, I'm going to have to write this.animal.this, right? And you'll notice there's some underscores. That's because I didn't update the serializer. Might be. We can probably eventually change that. You'll notice this is a lot of this.animal, right? But let's double check that this works. I'm gonna get rid of the debugger. If I still have it. Cool. So I've initialized this new animal right here. I'm doing generate HTML. I'm gonna refresh this page. And this still works. Do you see why it still works, right? I'm just create a method to print out the inner HTML for us. Yeah? How are we feeling? Cool. Remember, since I have this.animal a lot, right? I mentioned destructuring earlier. We can go ahead and do this. Cool. And then I can get rid of all of the this.animals. It'll still work. I'm gonna just expand that so you all can see that. You don't have to if you don't want to. This is going to eventually be very helpful.
In that case, do you have to get the order correct?
No, because this is an object, so the order doesn't really exist inside of an object. If it were an array, yes. We're on our way to object orientation. Cool. So here I'm now appending this, right? But this whole thing really could be something I can do in object orientation. I could go ahead right here and I could be like render. And I can go say all of this actually belongs in this function. I'm just gonna call render right here. Cool. Ooh, there we go. What do I call render on? Right, sorry. New animal. Did I say not save? There we go. Animal object is not defined. We're getting there. I'm going to take in, instead of doing animal object, I'm going to use this dot animal ID. And then I'm going to do this dot generated in HTML instead. So I'm saying right here is, hey, we're creating a card. We're adding this, we're adding its data set, we're creating its inner HTML, and then we're appending it to our animal list. This is still old JavaScript. The only exception is that we're using this .animal.id to do this. This is awesome that we can now do this, first off. Be like, hey, taking the animal, now we just have access to this .animal and any functions we want. We can call other functions right here. This is already getting really helpful. But this is still just some neat refactor, right? Like we're saying, hey, now instead of render one animal and then like doing a whole lot of stuff here, we're creating a card. We're doing a bunch of stuff right to it, and then we're appending it to the DOM. We're not doing anything really fancy here. Have I lost anyone yet? Right here. What's the most confusing part so far? The return card we're going to talk about in a bit. Cool. Omar, you're one step ahead and I like it. How are we feeling about this so far? We are now iterating through all the animals, initializing new animals, and then calling their render method. How, thumbs up, thumbs sideways, thumbs down before I go further? Cool. So what we're doing right now, we initialize this new animal from the fetch, right? This is all really happening in the fetch. We can, if I want to be like really explicit with what we're doing, we can like, hey, animals for each. We are like going right here. We're rendering all the animals. We're calling this for each of the animals. We're iterating them out. And then here we're initializing an instance of the animal class and calling its render function, right? And we still, in terms of our event listeners, they're still using event delegation. We're going to change that soon, right? Basically, right, our next step, if we want to use closures and stuff like that, there's a couple of useful things we can do. First off, we have access to a bunch of things. We can call this.card equals card li right here. I'm going to just go ahead and say, hey, whenever you create a card, save it to this so that we can keep track of this card. And this right here, combined with the fact that we always have access to this.animal, right, is going to make our lives with event listeners so much easier. Cool. I'm going to show you what I mean. Let's go ahead and let's create a new function. I'm going to call this add event listeners. I'm going to call it right here, this add event listeners. Cool. And then I'm just going to go this.card add event listener, double click. And then I'm going to just go ahead and say this.card.remove. It doesn't delete it from the backend, right? But you'll notice if I have access to this.card and I have access to like animal, right? I have most of what I need to do most of my event listeners very quick, very quickly and easily. I can change this. I can now delete this really quickly. I can be like, hey, get rid of all of these, or we'll comment them out for now. And instead, I'm going to say this card add an event listener, or actually this card query selector. Let's go ahead and grab this this item with the class of delete. I'm going to grab the delete button. I'm going to add a click event to it. Instead of saying this.card.remove, I'm just going to write this.remove. Cool. And you'll notice I made this an arrow function. There's a very specific reason why I did. I will talk about that in a second. Now I can just call, instead of doing anything fancy, I can be like, API.free animal this.animal.id .then this.card.remove. And this is all I need to do to add the delete functionality to my code. I'm saying, grab the animal that we have access to and remove this. This is way easier than whatever the hell we were doing before. Like, this is one line of code that does everything for us. And it's incredibly well organized. Cool. I'm going to test out that this works. And then I'm going to bum you all out with some weird thing about JavaScript. This works. We can refresh the page, and that baby red panda is gone forever, which has harmed me to do. I was a huge fan of the 2 baby red pandas in Central Park. But at the Central Park Zoo, they're the best thing to watch. They just are running around at all times. But they're free. Not really. The reason is because I can just get the ID from this.animal. And I can get the card from this because I stored them, right? I didn't have to like keep this, meticulously keep this within one function to like use the closure method. I didn't need to do anything else. I just had to be like, hey, everything I'm storing on the instance, so I don't have to ever lose it. I don't have to keep things in scope to keep track of them. I just have to get back to the instance eventually. The one heads up here, if I do this, we're actually going to get an error. I know this is going to bum everyone out, and that's the point of tomorrow's lecture. Ooh, what? Did I actually break this successfully by doing this? There we go. Can't read property of ID of undefined. I'm going to console log this right here. What does everyone think this is going to be when I console log it?
Isn't it whatever you call remove on?
Kind of, right? It's the functional context in which remove is invoked, right? The function that invoked this.remove. I console log it. Now, for some reason, it's the button, which is really weird. It's saying the button invoked this, which is true, right? Added an event listener to the button that triggered this. The first thing I'm going to tell you right now, if you ever run into this issue where you're like, hey, I thought this would stay the instance, usually the best solution is make this an arrow function. I try this again. Now this is the animal that gets deleted. I've been saying over the course of the last 5 weeks that arrow functions and regular functions are slightly different. The way they're different is that arrow functions will implicitly bind this and will not create their own functional scope. Which I'm going to get into in a lot of detail tomorrow. The short version is that if you want to pass something into an event listener inside the instance, definitely use arrow functions. In fact, when you get to React development, because this is such a common bug, I think React developers basically solely use arrow functions. If you run arrow functions, you will probably not run into problems in the rest of this program. If you just like inside your instances run arrow functions, and it is the basic it is the basic way of doing things in React. I'm going to show you tomorrow exactly why this works, and the former way of doing this, and a couple of other things that you will need to be able to answer in your code review. I'm skipping it because right now it's more important that you know how to build the code than that you like know the meticulous like rules of like how it all works. And that's what we're doing tomorrow. But if you make things an arrow function, you'll have less problems. And tomorrow I'll explain why. Cool. How are we feeling? Alarmed and confused that that's a thing? This is weird. It's one of the weirder concepts in React. It's one of those things where it's like, if like, even like people who have coded in React a while, like sometimes you go like, wait, this came out as that. We'll talk about that a bunch tomorrow. And it's gonna be one of the weirder lectures because I have to use the word this a lot. But here, I'm just gonna go right here. Boop, 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 boop. Cool. And then over here, I'm going to do it again. I'm going to do this.card.query selector. In this case, it's donate, right? Add event listener. Okay. This.donate. Here, I'm going to write donate equals boop, boop. And here, we did some weird things with donations. Oh no, I forgot to commit this whole time. That's bad. No, and I also am using a different computer than I usually use, so my shortcuts are all messed up too. Get rid of this. Thank you. This ID, right? Cool. Here for donations, we did a couple. Ian did a couple of weird things, right? He's parsing. If we want to take a look, right? He's parsing the donate. He's selecting the donation count from the actual DOM. He's parsing it, right? Adding 10 to it. And then he's sending that information over. Because we now have everything in our scope, we never have to do this goofy stuff again where we have to be like, oh crap, it's only stored on the DOM. We can always just go back to our instance and decide now it's stored on this, right? And this is the real thing about object orientation. You don't have to be really creative in how you store things. You can just go like, hey, man, I wish I had that data. Let me go back to my constructor and make sure I have it. Or let me go back to the function that creates it and make sure I have it. And then it just makes your closures have a lot more discipline without you really having to struggle through keeping it all in one function. So here I'm going to dump all of this. And instead, my new donation function, I'm going to be like this.animal.donations plus equals 10. First things first, I'm going to add 10 to the donations that we're tracking on our backend, right? Or on our like JavaScript front end, rather, not the backend. Then I'm going to call api.donate. And then I'm going to say this.animal ID. This.animal.donations. And then last, I think we do have to select he was doing something weird. Card, this.card. At this point, it's in donation class. or donation count. So I'm going to query selector dot donation count dot inner text equals this dot animal dot donations. Cool. Another thing I might want to do, I might do like a dot then. If I want to make this pessimistic, I'd be like then res to this dot animal equals res, like take that, rewrite this. And we can do like, this is another way to do it. I might just be losing you because I'm thinking through a couple of different ways to do this, right? In this case, we could just be like this. Loop. You can also go ahead and if you really want to be the laziest possible developer, you can go ahead and say, no, this is still what you want. Cool. I'm not going to mess with that. I'm gonna double check that this all works because now I've thought about this. Oh no. Undefined server error because I was sending it to animals that's undefined. What did I do wrong? This.animal.id. Oh, dot donations. Plus 10. And then in my API service class, we have donation to this ID, this. Oh no. Oh God, I broke everything. All right, then I just delete this. Done. Cool. Animal / undefined. Oh, weird. Right. I figured out the issue, folks. So I realized I was just talking to myself for the last 3 minutes. I forgot to do this. So I was overwriting the animal instance with the actual cores object. You'll notice this animal is now this bad boy. It's a little much. I'm gonna double check. Now this works. Cool. This works. Cool. Yeah. So I'm doing here just to like really show you what I did exactly. I'm donating to my backend, then taking the response. I'm taking my backend's response animal, and then I'm updating the animal that I've stored on the front end, and then using that to rewrite the inner text. It's really important. Just remember that you're going to have to manually update. You're gonna have to manually update your stored animal object on the front end. If you like go ahead and you like send an update to your back end, you have to be like, okay, and then after that, make my new data the new animal. Does that make sense? Cool. Naomi, so the delete button, I went ahead and I said, hey, send this to the back end using the ID, then delete my whole card for me. And I added that to the delete button. Yeah. Does that make sense? Cool. The last thing, right? We actually have access to a couple of other useful tools, right? So right now we can delete this. So now all we have here is the light switch and this little chain, this immediate chain, right? We can make this a static method, right? static render all animals. Boop, boop, boop. Animal. Boop, boop. All right, let's do animals for each. At this point, I might decide to make this its own thing. I'm just going to copy this code. Boop, boop. I'm going to make sure that I'm going to like make this a little bit clearer. So I'm saying is, hey, first fetch all the animals, then for each of the animals, create a new animal and render. And now all I need to do here, I can delete all of this. And I can, where are we invoking get all animals? Let's go right here and I can say animal, like get render all animals. And here, should save. This goes ahead, gives me all my animals. We're back to functional, but now this is incorporated in its own animal scope, right? Which is a little bit neater, right? We can now be like, hey, cool. Our animal class is entirely self-contained. The last thing we should do, right? We might want to be like, hey, static create animal from form. I'm just going to go ahead and cut basically all of this. So saying event.target, I'm going to say form. Cool. And then right here, I'm just going to call it animal dot create. Just going to say create from form. I try not to use the word animal in an animal class, right? Because that gets a little redundant. You can just be like create from form. If you don't like, if you're choosing between render animal and render, just choose render in your code. I'm just going to go ahead and pass an event.default or .target here because that's going to be the form. I'm going to be ending this in about 30 seconds. So, or like I'm going to be 7 questions once I prove that this works. But yes, feel free to leave. Sorry, I will try to be much clearer on how much time, more time make things take afterwards, but I'll be like animal. Cool. We're gonna adopt this. Ooh, we're gonna save this. Try one more time, sorry. Rex, Rex, Rex. I legitimately saved you. I'm sorry. But then, I actually have to write that code out. No. I might be rushing this slightly in a kind of goofy way. Animal, render one, cool. T-Rex, T-Rex. Nope. Nope. Yeah, you are always welcome to. Cool, so now this works too. So what I did right here is I just pulled out my like everything that has to do with an animal to the animal class right here. Or that has to do with creating these little instances. And now let's take a look at our code, right? We have some event listeners that mostly work for dark mode, and then one event listener for creating a form, and everything else is handled inside of animal, right? Which will go ahead and it's going to initialize a bunch of animals, right? Depending on this like call to render all animals, right? It'll create the form and this will all work. Cool. I'm gonna like build this out like 4 or 5 more times. I'm gonna build a bunch more things with this. Feel free to dive out. If you have any more questions, I will stay around for another 5 minutes. Then I too am very hungry. But we're going to be digging through this a whole lot more. The big thing to take away, object orientation made this code a lot more organized, but it also gave us access to this.animal and this.card, right? Like us deciding to do that allowed us to solve a bunch of our own, like a bunch of problems that would have previously required us to like go to the DOM to find information. Right now, I'm making this look very simple and I'm making this look like this is a logical progression. It won't feel that way to you. The important thing to remember is when we're initializing instances, right? We can store things on this for ourselves and we can choose what to store. And then we don't have to worry so much about what we stored on the DOM, about getting information from the DOM, because we just decided like, actually, we're going to throw this into this instead. Eventually what I'm going to show you on Thursday is how we can use event delegation with this to go from, hey, I have this one thing on the DOM. I would like to use my instance methods. How do I do that? And I will show you how to make that happen. But for now, you'll notice this is some pretty useful code. It's very straightforward. And this is what object orientation will do for us. Thank you. I know this was a weird lecture. I know I was teaching things backwards and that was a test. Thank you for being the guinea pigs. Anyone have any questions? And you can feel free to leave at this point. You also could feel free to leave at any lecture at any point, but yeah. Omar, I'm going to answer that question in 2 ways. Outside JS libraries are totally fair game. Straight up. Scaffolding, right? Now that we don't have views, doesn't do much different than resources. Like resources will do all the things that you really want it to do and kind of leave you without a lot of the junk. If you use scaffolding for your backend, you're going to be left with some pretty weird content that I wrote it with. And just be prepared to justify that to your reviewers. I would recommend using the resource generator though, because it gives you everything that you really need. You don't need a creative view.
I just have a quick question.
Yeah.
So for can you scroll down a little on the animal? Yeah. So this render one, weeks ago you mentioned that if you put parentheses for the function, it's invoking it. But for line 59 and 77, you don't invoke the function. I'm just wondering why.
That's a really good question. So for each expects a callback. So a function that we're not invoking, right? For each, usually when we write for each, we do something like animal that then we write some code that describes it, right? But you'll notice this is actually kind of redundant. What we're doing is we're defining an anonymous function in here that then takes an animal and invokes this function with that animal. if we just want to like, in that case, you can just go ahead and whenever you write something like that, you can reduce it to this because this is just the actual function that we're passing as a callback.
Oh, I see.
Mhm.
Okay. Okay, yeah. Okay, I see. Okay. Okay, thank you.
This material, the past few lectures have been brutal.
Yeah. We're gonna call it animal, not create. We're going to spend a lot of time reviewing it. That's the reason why I wanted to get to it 3 weeks early though, like, or 2 weeks early, was because I wanted to spend a lot of time building this out. So it doesn't feel like you're really rushed in learning it. I did a lot of code here though, right? Eventually when you get this, a lot of things clear up for you, but this is like, this personal design pattern is kind of mine. Or like, I'm going to show you a couple of other things we used, right? Like I was the person who was just like, why aren't we, when we're forcing them to do object orientation, why are we not storing card, right? And I kind of like, but this took 2 years to get to for me, to the point where I'm like, I write really neat JavaScript code that is self-explanatory in object orientation. I'm going to try my best to give you the best exposure in 3 weeks, but we have time and I will try to prepare you to make sure that you know what's going on. If you're really stumped in a week from now or 2 weeks, right? Definitely bring this up with me, okay?
Thank you.
Cool.
I got a question real quick.
Yeah.
I ran into something today on a lab where I had defined a function as like one of those arrow key functions. And I used this inside of it. And the coach had me use function. And then the, I don't know what it's called, the parentheses argument box. And then continue with the function. And this was different in the way that they had, like, I don't understand, like, why is it different?
That's going to be the entire subject of tomorrow because it's really weird. An arrow function, right? I'm going to discuss this tomorrow because there's a lot that I'm going to demonstrate. And I also kind of want to review this so I know exactly how to say this in a way that's not insanely confusing. But
That's
basically,
fair enough.
yeah, an arrow function implicitly binds this. If you've seen the word bind before, that's what an arrow function will do for us. So using an arrow function right here is the same thing as kind of doing bind this. What I'm saying right here is, and in this new callback function, this should be this. You can also make, nope, this is, I'm being tempted into teaching a lecture today too early. I'll talk about it tomorrow. Cool. Tomorrow we'll get it.
Is tomorrow's lecture also an hour and a half or is it shorter?
It's shorter.
I'm gonna have to try to watch the recording. Will there be a recording on the main?
Yes.
Awesome.
Cool. And tomorrow's it's going to be like, remember way back when I was showing you that functions could be called by other functions and like have a bunch of other stuff, right? It's going to be a lot of that. So it's going to be a little bit of a fire hose of information that's largely irrelevant. I'm going to try my best to highlight the points that I'm trying to highlight. But this is really weird. Cool. Anything else? Omar, amazing shirt as always. All right, I'm gonna let you all go.